The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, was one of the most influential witch treatises of its time.
Malleus Maleficarum.
The witch's hammer.
Several treatises concerning witchcraft was released during this time, but the Malleus proved to be the most popular, still being relevant 3 centuries after its publication. The Malleus was written as a guide to witchcraft, how it worked, who the witches were, and how to properly punish them. It's divided into 3 different sections. The first consists of questions relating to witchcraft and whether it really exists. The second part gives us real-life stories and examples of people who have had first-hand experiences with witchcraft, and then the third goes in depth on how the legal proceedings should be made. So, what most people know about this book is that it's incredibly misogynistic. Women at the time were thought to be, way more horny than men. They were thought to be weak-minded and controlled by their lust in such a way that it damaged their intellect. What made the Malleus different from other witch treatises from this time was that it linked witchcraft to womanhood and female sexuality way more forcefully than all the other texts. The book claimed that adulterous drabs and whores are chiefly given to witchcraft, and female sexuality was seen as a dangerous thing, as women could use their sexual power over men to gain access to higher ranks in society. So in this video we're going to go through the entire thing from start to finish for all of you people who are really curious about what this book actually says, but might not be into reading a 300-page treatise from the 15th century. I recommend that you pause the video right here, make yourself a nice cup of tea. I got mine right here, and we can start going through this thing together. So my version of this book is the Kindle version, but there's a free version you can download off of Global Grey eBooks. I'll put a link in the description for anyone who wants it. Anyway, on to part 1. So the book starts out with the question whether witchcraft is real or not. For certain writers pretending to base their opinion upon the words of S. Thomas, when he treats the impediments brought about by magic charms, have tried to maintain that there is not such a thing as magic, that it only exists in the imagination of those men who ascribe natural effects, the cause whereof are not known, to witchcraft and spells. There are others who acknowledge, indeed, that witches exist, but they declare that the influence of magic and the effects of charms are purely imaginary and phantasmical. A third class of writers maintain that the effects said to be wrought by magic spells are altogether illusory and fanciful, although it may be that the devil does really lend his aid to some witch. So they write that some people claim that people's imaginations are so grand that they simply imagine magic. But that's wrong, the writers claim, but this is contrary to the true faith, which teaches us that certain angels fell from heaven and are now devils, and we are bound to acknowledge that by their very nature they can do many wonderful things which we cannot do, and those who try to induce others to perform such evil wonders are called witches. It's concluded quite early in this book that witchcraft does exist, on the basis that the devil is real and so witches must exist. The book doesn't really linger too long on this question. However, most of the following book deals with questions such as how big are the sins of witches, who are really to blame for witchcraft, witches or the devil, and how come God allows all of this. So part 1 of the Malleus is divided into 18 different questions concerning different aspects of witchcraft. And I'll go through some of those chapters and questions here. Question number 2 in the Malleus talks about witch's responsibility in everything. Is it the devil who's using the witch as his instrument? Is he the one controlling her? And should she be guilty of the actions committed? Is it the devil or the witch that are committing these crimes? The book also talks a little bit about inherent sin, and mentions that women are more susceptible to evil by their inherent nature. They mention unseen energies that can be found in the universe, such as magnets and how they are able to attract iron. And in the same way, women have an intrinsic magic to them that is not attributed to the devil. And so women, in order to bring about changes in the bodies of others sometimes, makes use of certain things which exceed our knowledge, but this is without any aid from the devil. And because these remedies are mysterious, we must not therefore ascribe them to the power of the devil, as we should ascribe evil spells wrought by witches. The chapters that follow this one deals with incubi and succubi, and the usual sperm-stealing demons. The devil or other demons were thought to steal semen from men, usually by portraying themselves as young women or succubi, and then implanting the semen into women. There were a lot of sexual themes in relation to witches and how the myths about them were portrayed. A lot of the stuff mentioned in this book deal with infertility, the inability to perform in the bedroom, as well as a fear of having your dick cut off. I feel like the authors of this book and Freud would have been great friends. So chapter 6 of the first part of the book was pretty tough to get through. This chapter deals with the question why women are more likely to be seduced by the devil and practice witchcraft. Therefore, let us now chiefly consider women, and first, why this kind of perfidy is found more in so fragile a sex than in men. And our inquiry will first be general, as to the general conditions of women. Secondly, particular as to which sort of women are found to be given to superstition and witchcraft, and thirdly, specifically with regard to midwives who surpass all others in wickedness. Women at this time were thought to be the weaker sex, and also thought to be driven by their lust in a way that made them basically crazy. I suppose it's kind of weird to think that now, because these days it is men who are thought to be the overly horny ones. But I guess we still have this sense of women being seen as chaotic or irrational, which was kind of the same idea. Women were in need of a husband and or pregnancy, as those things would control her libido in a way that would make her more reasonable. And then for some reason the book just kind of attacks midwives. Midwifery was a female-dominated profession, and at the time of the witch hunt, men started to take over these kinds of professions more and more. After the release of the Malleus, women had much more difficult time finding work, as they now had to prove that they were a good Christian, and more male midwives were hired. The Malleus even have a whole chapter dedicated to the evils of midwives, but more about that when we get to it. Now, the wickedness of women is spoken of in Ecclesiasticus 25. There is no head above the head of a serpent, and there is no wrath above the wrath of a woman. I had rather dwell with a lion and a dragon than to keep house with a wicked woman. What else is woman but a foe to friendship? An unescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted with fair colours. Therefore, if it be a sin to divorce her when she ought to be kept, it is indeed a necessary torture, for either we commit adultery by divorcing her, or we must endure daily strife. And then we get to the root issue when it comes to women, according to the Malleus. But the natural reason is that she is more carnal than man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations, and it should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast, which is bent as it were in a contrary direction to a man. And since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. If there ever was a time for a good old-fashioned book burning. So, chapter 8 of the first part is where we finally get into what this book is really about. which is male genitalia. Like I said earlier when I was talking about those pesky sperm-stealing demons, a lot about witchcraft had to do with men's fear of sex. There was a fear of not being able to perform, there was a fear of overtly sexual women, there was even a fear of literally having your dick cut off. Witchcraft was also to blame in cases where women didn't want to sleep with their husbands, so instead of blaming all of these things on two people who don't want to be with each other, it was instead blamed on witchcraft. Serpents are more subject to magic spells than are other animals, and a little later he says, "It is the same in the case of a woman, for the devil can so darken her understanding that she considers her husband so loathsome that not for all the world would she allow him to lie with her." And then we get to the actual dick removing parts. It may be said that this is done with the divine permission, and in that case, it has already been said that God allows more power of witchcraft over the genital functions on account of the first corruption of sin which came to us from the act of generation. So also he allows greater power over the actual genital organ, even to its removal. And again, it was a greater thing to turn Lot's wife into a pillar of salt than it is to take away the male organ. So this is kind of when the book starts to become a little wacky. Up until now, the book has mostly mentioned stuff that happens to anyone that can be attributed to normal things. Like, just general infertility, the lack of, getting a boner, stuff like that. But now the authors mean that they were actual cases of men's penises that were literally gone. Peter's member has been taken off. Sucks to be Peter. And he does not know whether it is by witchcraft or in some other way by the devil's power, with the permission of God. Are there any ways of determining or distinguishing between these? It can be answered as follows. First, that those to whom such things most commonly happen are adulterers or fornicators, for when they fail to respond to the demand of their mistress, or if they wish to desert them and attach themselves to other women, then their mistress, out of vengeance, through some other power causes their members to be taken off. Secondly, it can be distinguished by the fact that it is not permanent, for if it's not due to witchcraft, then the loss is not permanent, but it will be restored sometime. So in part 2 of this book, there's some actual stories of men who have had their penis removed or claimed to have their penis removed, which will give a little bit more insight to how this would have been experienced. So we'll get to that bit a little bit later when we get there. So anyway, this chapter concludes that in most cases this is caused by an illusion created by the witch using glamours, which means that the penis is not actually gone. It just looks and feels like it is. In other cases, though, the penis is actually removed, and this effect can be permanent or not permanent depending on the case. The female effect of this curse is to become infertile, or suffer miscarriages, and the book goes into further detail about this and also links it to witch midwives. Those pesky witch midwives! The canonists treat more fully than the theologians of the obstructions due to witchcraft, and they say that it is witchcraft not only when anyone is unable to perform the carnal act, of which we have spoken above, but also when a woman is prevented from conceiving or is made to miscarry after she has conceived. A third and fourth method of witchcraft is when they have failed to produce an abortion, and then either devour the child or offer it to a devil. No one does more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives, for when they do not kill children, then, as if for some other purpose, they take them out of the room and, raising them up in the air, offer them to devils. So those last few quotes were about these witch midwives. So the rest of part 1 then deals with how the sin of witchcraft compares to other sins, and why it's one of the worst sins that can be committed. It is clear from this that the heresy of witches is the most heinous of the 3 degrees of infidelity, and this fact is proven both by reason and authority, for it is said in 2 Peter 2, it has been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than, after they have known it, to turn from it. And again, the Jews sin more greatly than the pagans, for they received the prophecy of the Christian faith in the old law, which they corrupt through badly interpreting it, which is not the case with the pagans. Therefore, their infidelity is greater sin than that of the Gentiles, who never received the faith of the gospel. So what they're saying is, because witches choose to do evil after they know they should not do it, their sins are heavier than others. So part 2 of this treatise give a more concrete example and stories of people who have been the subject of witchcraft. It starts up with this story about how a man gets cursed by a witch. An example of how this happened to one man has been made known to us. A certain well-born citizen of Spires had a wife who was of such an obstinate disposition that, though he tried to please her in every way, yet she refused in nearly every way to comply with his wishes, and was always plaguing him with abusive taunts. It happened that, on going into his house one day, and his wife railing against him as usual with opprobrious words, he wished to go out of the house to escape from quarrelling, but she quickly ran before him and locked the door by which he wished to go out, and loudly swore that, unless he beat her, there was no honesty or faithfulness in him. At these heavy words he stretched out his hand, not intending to hurt her, and struck her lightly with his open palm on her buttock, whereupon he suddenly fell to the ground and lost all his senses, and lay in bed for many weeks afflicted with a most grievous illness. Now it is obvious that this was not a natural illness, but was caused by some witchcraft of the woman, and very many similar cases have happened and been made known to many. I feel like this story speaks for itself in how witchcraft was viewed by society. Women were supposed to be docile, do what they're told, and as soon as they raised a fuss, they were accused of witchcraft. I'm sure far from every witchcraft case was like this. There was often political motivation to accuse someone of witchcraft, but I feel like as a whole, it was a lot of blaming women for not doing what was expected of them. So chapter 1 of part 2 deals with how the devil managed to trick the women into servitude to him, and how witches increase their numbers, how they recruit other people to also become witches. The most common way this is done is by playing into the lust of women. Towards young girls, more given to bodily lusts and pleasures, they observe a different method, working through their carnal desires and the pleasures of the flesh. Here it is to be noted that the devil is more eager and keen to tempt the good than the wicked, although in actual practice he tempts the wicked more than the good, because more aptitude for being tempted is found in the wicked than in the good. Therefore the devil tries all the harder to seduce all the more saintly virgins and girls, and there's reason in this, besides many examples of it. So Malleus frequently gives little stories that act as evidence to support the author's claims, and in this part in particular, they're telling stories of young virgins who have been tempted by witches to join them, but who have escaped by blessing themselves. Another virgin living in the Diocese of Strasbourg confessed to one of us that she was alone on a certain Sunday in her father's house when an old woman of that town came to visit here and, among other scurrilous words, made the following proposition, that if she liked, she would take her to a place where there were some young men unknown to all the townsmen, and when, said the virgin, I consented and followed her to her house, the old woman said, "See, we go upstairs to an upper room where the young men are, but take care not to make the sign of the cross. I gave her my promise not to do so, and as she was going up before me and I was going up the stairs, I secretly crossed myself. At the top of the stairs, when we were both standing outside the room, the hag turned angrily upon me with horrible countenance, and looking at me said, 'Curse you! Why did you cross yourself? Go away from here. Depart in the name of the devil. And so I returned unharmed to my home. Playing into the lust of young women was not the only way the devil tempted women to become subservient to him. The Malleus also tells us that women often use the aid of the devil to get out of poverty or to exert revenge on men who have slept with them without marrying them. There is also a third method of temptation through the way of sadness and poverty. For when girls have been corrupted and have been scorned by their lovers after they have immodestly copulated with them in the hope of promise of marriage with them, and have found themselves disappointed in all their hopes and everywhere despised, they turn to the help and protection of devils, either for the sake of vengeance by bewitching those lovers or the wives they have married, or for the sake of giving themselves up to every sort of lechery. Alas! Experience tells us that there is no number to such girls, and consequently the witches that spring from this class are innumerable. One of the most integral parts of the myth of the witch was her pact she made with the devil. The devil was the one who granted her powers, and it was said there was a ceremony where she swore subservience to him. Now the method of profession is twofold. One is a solemn ceremony, like a solemn vow. The other is private, and can be made to the devil at any hour alone. The first method is when witches meet together in the conclave on a set day, and the devil appears to them in the assumed body of a man, and urges them to keep faith with him, promising them worldly prosperity and length of life, and they recommended a novice to his acceptance. And the devil asks whether she will abjure her faith and forsake the holy Christian religion and the worship of the anomalous woman, for so they call the most blessed Virgin Mary, and never venerate the sacraments. And if he finds the novice or disciple willing, then the devil stretches out his hand, and so does the novice, and she swears with upraised hand to keep that covenant. And when this is done, the devil at once adds that this is not enough, and when the disciple asks what more must be done, the devil demands the following oath of homage to himself, that she give herself to him, body and soul, forever, and do her utmost to bring others of both sexes into his power. He adds, finally, that she is to make certain unguents from the bones and limbs of children, especially those who have been baptized, by all which means she will be able to fulfill all her wishes with his help. The second part of the myth was that witches gathered in what was known as witches' sabbaths. These sabbaths would be held from time to time, and witches from all across the land would gather and feast on a huge banquet, dance naked under the moonlight, and partake in numerous orgies with the devil, other demons, and each other. The descriptions of what went on at these gatherings were absurd and included eating the flesh of newborn babies and sacrificing infants to the devil. The Malleus goes into depth in chapter 3 of part 2 about how witches supposedly got to this Sabbath. The Sabbath was often hosted very far away, and so there was this myth created that witches could fly. This explained how they could travel sometimes hundreds of miles away to attend this nocturnal Sabbath. The most common explanation of how the witch made herself airborne was that it came from a magic ointment that was applied to either a piece of wood, such as a broom, or directly onto herself. The ointment then gave the object or the witch the ability to fly. Now the following is their method of being transported. They take the unguent, which, as we have said, they make at the devil's instruction from the limbs of children, particularly of those who they have killed before baptism, and anoint with a chair or a broomstick, whereupon they are immediately carried up into the air, either by day or by night, and either visibly or, if they wish, invisibly. For the devil can conceal a body with the interposition of some other substance, as was shown in the first part of the treatise, where we spoke of the glamours and illusions caused by the devil. And although the devil for the most part performs this by means of this unguent, to the end that children should be deprived of the grace of baptism and of salvation, yet he often seems to effect the same transvection without its use. For at times he transports the witches on animals, which are not true animals, but devils in that form, and sometimes even without any exterior help, they are visibly carried solely by the operations of the devil's power. The myth about witches traveling on animals came from the myth of the pagan goddess Diana, who was said to ride through villages and cities at night on the backs of wild animals. As she rode through, she invited women to join her on her journey, and this was called the Wild Hunt. There were also other old myths about women turning into treatises or screeching owls at night that flew into people's homes to devour their infants. This belief was quite popular and shared between many different cultures. And one of the Latin words used to describe witches was the word streges, so it makes sense that this myth also influenced the belief of the flying witch. So, moving on to the 5th chapter of part 2, we learn more about what kind of curses witches put on people and how they presented themselves. And with regard to the first class of injuries with which they afflict the human race, is to be noted that apart from the methods by which they injure other creatures, they have 6 ways of injuring humanity. And one is to include an evil love in a man for a woman, or in a woman for a man. The second is to plant hatred or jealousy in anyone. The third is to bewitch them so that a man cannot perform the genital act with a woman, or conversely a woman with a man, or by various means to procure an abortion, as has been said before. The fourth is to cause some disease in any of the human organs. The fifth, to take away life. The sixth, to deprive them of reason. We also get some more information about penis curses and how they work, because isn't that what is truly the most important thing here? Intrinsically, they cause it in 2 ways. First, when they directly prevent the erection of the member, which is accommodated to fructification. And this need not seem impossible when it's considered that they are able to vitate the natural use of any member. Secondly, when they prevent the flow of the vital essences to the members in which resides in the motive force, closing up the seminal ducts so that it does not reach the generative vessels, or so that it cannot be ejaculated or is fruitlessly spilled. So, when we went through the chapter that mentioned how witches deprive men of their penises, I told you there would be some actual stories about it. Well, here's one. A similar experience is narrated by a certain venerable father from the Dominican house of Spires, well known in the order for the honest of his life and for his learning. One day, he says, while I was hearing confessions, a young man came to me and in the course of his confession woefully said that he had lost his member. Being astonished at this, and not being willing to give it easy credence, since the opinion of the wise it is mark of light-heartedness to believe too easily, I obtained proof of it when I saw nothing on the young man's removing his clothes and showing the place. Then, using the wisest counsel I could, I asked whether he suspected anyone of having so bewitched him. And the young man said that he did suspect someone, but that she was absent and living in Worms. Then I said, I advise you to go to her as soon as possible and try your utmost to soften her with gentle words and promises. And he did so, for he came back after a few days and thanked me, saying that he was whole and had recovered everything, and I believed his words, but again proved them by the evidence of my eyes. So now we also have another story from a guy who claimed that he lost his penis because of a witch, and this is probably my favorite story in the entire book. And what then is to be thought of those witches who in this way sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest or shut them in a box, where they move themselves like living members and eat oats and corn, as has been seen by many and is a matter of common report? It is to be said that it is all done by the devil's work and illusion, for the senses of those who see them are deluded in the way we have said. For a certain man tells that, when he had lost his member, he approached a known witch to ask her to restore it to him. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, and that he might take which he liked out of the nest, which there were several members. And when he tried to take a big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one," adding, because it belongs to a parish priest. Alright now, don't forget to feed your pet penises with some oats and corn now. We don't want to end up with a bird's nest full of dead penises, like last year. Just kidding. I just think that's just like the most ridiculous story ever. So she basically said that this guy lost his penis, and then the witch told him to climb a tree and pick out the penis he liked the most from a bird's nest where they had a bunch of penises wiggling around eating oats and corn. Okay, right. Moving on. There's some chapters coming up that deals with other stories about witchcraft in a similar way to the ones I just mentioned, but before that, there's some questions raised by the Malleus about how the devil manages to possess other people, and again, if it is the witches or the devils who are actually the bad guys. Possessions, the Malleus says, work in the way that the devil is simply causing the mental images to shift around. He's not actually injecting himself into another person, as he doesn't have an actual body, and this is why he's able to do it without inflicting any pain. But it is asked how he can do this without causing pain in the head. The answer is easy. For in the first place, he does not cause any actual physical change in the organs, but only moves the mental images. And secondly, he does not affect these changes by injecting any active quality which would necessarily cause pain, since the devil is himself without any corporal quality, and can therefore operate without the use of any such quality. Thirdly, as has been said, he effects these transmutations only by a local movement from one organ to another, and not by other movements through which painful transformations are sometimes caused. And now we have some more stories about people who have been cursed by witches with some sort of leprosy. A certain honest laborer spoke roughly to a certain quarrelsome woman, and she angrily threatened him that she would soon avenge herself on him. He took little notice of her, but on the same night he felt a pustule grow upon his neck, and he rubbed it a little, and found his whole face and neck puffed up and swollen, and a horrible form of leprosy appeared all over his body. He immediately went to his friends for advice, and told them of the woman's threat, and said that he would stake his life on the suspicion that this had been done to him by the magic art of that same witch. In short, the woman was taken, questioned, and confessed her crimes. But when the judge asked her particularly about the reason for it and how she had done it, she answered, "When that man used abusive words to me, I was angry and went home, and my familiar began to ask the reason for my ill humor. I told him and begged him to avenge me on the man, and he asked what I wanted him to do to him, and I answered that I wished he would always have a swollen face. And the devil went away and afflicted the man even beyond my asking, for I had not hoped that he would infect him with such sore leprosy. And so the woman was burnt." And here's another story from the same chapter, which is, the story is a bit longer and also goes into how you would be cured from this leprosy. When an inquisition was being held on some witches in the town of Innsbruck, the following case, among others, was brought to light. A certain honest woman, who had been legally married to one of the household of the Archduke, formally deposed the following. In the time of her maidenhood, she had been in the service of one of the citizens, whose wife became afflicted with a grievous pains in the head, and a woman who said she could cure her. And so began the certain incantations and rites, which she said would assuage the pains. And I carefully watched, said this woman, what she did, and saw that against the nature of water poured into a vase, she caused water to rise in its vessel, together with other ceremonies which there is no need to mention. And considering the pains in my mistress's head were not assuaged by these means, I addressed the witch in some indignation with these words: "I do not know what you are doing, but whatever it is witchcraft, and you are doing it for your own profit." Then the witch at once replied, "You will know in 3 days whether I am a witch or not." And so it proved, for on the 3rd day, when I sat down and took up a spindle, I suddenly felt a terrible pain in my body. First it was inside me, so that it seemed that there was no part of my body in which I did not feel horrible shooting pains. Then it seemed to me just as if burning coals were being continually heaped upon my head. Thirdly, from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, there was no place large enough for a pinprick that was not covered with a rash of white pustules, and so I remained in these pains, crying out and wishing only for death until the 4th day. At last my mistress's husband told me to go to a certain tavern, and with great difficulty I went, whilst he walked before, until we were in front of the tavern. "See," he said to me, "there is a loaf of white bread over the tavern door." "I see," I said. Then he said, "Take it down, if you possibly can, for it may do you good." And I, holding on to the door with one hand as much as I could, got hold of the loaf with the other. "Open it," said my master, "and look carefully at what's inside." Then I had broken up the loaf. I found many things inside it, especially some white grains, very like the pustules on my body, and I saw also some seeds and herbs such as I could not eat or even look at, with the bones of serpents and other animals. In my astonishment, I asked my master what was to be done, and he told me to throw it all into the fire. I did so, and behold, suddenly, not in an hour or even a few minutes, but at the moment when that matter was thrown into the fire, I regained all my former health. So most of the curses mentioned in the Malleus was said to take effect verbally, and some by using some sort of charm placed in or outside someone's home. Snake heads were said to be placed under people's stairs in order to put a hex on them, and sometimes the witch would just say something like, "You'll regret what you have done to me," or something else to that effect. So moving on to the next chapter, we again get to read about what terrible people midwives are. The chapter starting off with, "We must not omit to mention the injuries done to children by witch midwives. First by killing them, and secondly by blasphemously offering them to devils." Witches were believed to be the cause of infertility. Like, witches could be blamed for trying to end all of humanity or something. And in this chapter we get to read some stories from people who had encountered these so-called witch midwives. "I was," she says, "pregnant by my lawful husband, now dead, and as my time approached, a certain midwife importuned me to engage her to assist at the birth of my child. But I knew her bad reputation, and although I had decided to engage another woman, pretended with conciliatory words to agree to her request. But when the pains came upon me, and I had brought in another midwife, the first one was very angry, and hardly a week later came into my room one night with 2 other women, and approached the bed where I was lying. And when I tried to call my husband, who was sleeping in another room, all the use was taken away from my limbs and tongue, so that except for seeing and hearing I could not move a muscle. And the witch, standing between the other 2, said, 'See, this vile woman who would not take me for her midwife shall not win through unpunished.' The other 2 standing by her pleaded for me, saying, 'She has never harmed any of us.' But the witch added, 'Because she has offended me, I am going to put something into her entrails. But, to please you, she shall not feel any pain for half a year, but after that time she shall be tortured enough.' So she came up and touched my belly with her hands, and it seemed to me that she took out my entrails and put something which, however, I could not see, and when they had gone away I had recovered my power of speech. I called my husband as soon as possible, and told him what had happened, but he put it down to pregnancy and said, 'You pregnant women are always suffering from fancies and delusions.' And when he would by no means believe me, I replied, 'I have been given 6 months' grace, and if after that time no torment comes to me, I shall believe you.' She related this to her son, a cleric who was then archdeacon of the district, and who came to visit her on the same day. And what happened? When exactly 6 months had passed, such a terrible pain came into her belly that she could not help disturbing everyone with her cries day and night." Now, the reason for such practices is as follows. It is to be presumed that witches are compelled to do such things at the command of evil spirits, and sometimes against their own wills. For the devil knows that, because of the pain of loss, of original sin, such children are debarred from entering the kingdom of heaven, and by this means the last judgment is delayed. when the devils will be condemned to eternal torture, since the number of the elect is more slowly completed, on the fulfillment of which the world will be consumed, and also, as has already been shown, witches are taught by the devil to confect from the limbs of such children an unguent which is very useful for their spells. For some reason, using the limbs of children was often said to be used in witches' potions and spells. It's kind of crazy just how absurd some of these things witches were accused of were. Anyway, part 2 of the Malleus is for some reason divided into 2 sections. So the last few chapters of part 1 of the second... So the last chapters of the last part of the first part of part 2 deals with witchcraft relating to livestock and how witches are able to conjure up hailstorms and ruin crops for other farmers. Oh yeah, there's also one whole chapter about male witch archers, which was a type of witch that was unique to men who were thought to use sorcery to improve their archery skills. Lastly, the book also asks the questions whether you can and should use sorcery or witchcraft in order to cure yourself from curses caused by witchcraft. It's argued that you should not. However, it's encouraged to bless yourself using the sign of the cross or holy water or anything else that is in relation to the Christian faith. So, the second part of the book starts off great. And I'm obviously kidding, it starts off terribly. There is one section in particular where incubi are mentioned and how they seem to really enjoy long, beautiful hair. William of Paris noted also that incubus seem chiefly to molest women and girls with beautiful hair, either because they devote themselves too much to the care and adornment of their hair, or because they are boastfully vain about it, or because God in his goodness permits this so that women may be afraid to entice men by the very means by which the devil wished to entice men. The way this section is phrased makes it seem like women are kind of asking for it by growing their hair long and beautiful, and that this is happening to women so that they will be afraid of enticing men with their looks. But it must also be remarked that sometimes persons only think they are molested by an incubus when they are not so actually, and this is more apt to be the case with women than with men, for they are more timid and liable to imagine extraordinary things. And then we have this little quote that is basically just a medieval way of accusing women of falsely accusing men of rape. Although far more women are witches than men, as was shown in the first part of the work, yet men are more often bewitched than women. And the reason for this lies in the fact that God allows the devil more power over the venereal act by which the original sin is handed down than over other human actions. It's the same way he allows more witchcraft to be performed by means of serpents, which are more subject to incantations than other animals, because that was the first instrument of the devil, and the venereal act can be more readily and easily bewitched in a man than in a woman, as has been clearly shown. And we're back with the boners again. So here I just want to point out that original sin refers to how Eve was punished for eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. Women were punished because of this to give birth in pain, and women were thought to be born already sinners and impure, which is, nice stuff. But yeah, back to the boners. This whole chapter is again how men's penises can be bewitched so they don't work, and the book claims that this can happen in 5 ways. For the devil, being a spirit, has by his very nature power, which God's permission over a bodily creature, especially to promote or to prevent local motion. So by this power they can prevent the bodies of men and women from approaching each other, and this either directly or indirectly. Directly when they remove one to a distance from another, and do not allow him to approach the other, indirectly when they cause some obstruction or when they interpose themselves in an assumed body. So it happened that a young pagan who had married an idol but nonetheless contracted a marriage with a girl. Because of this, he was unable to copulate with her, and as has been shown above. Secondly, the devil can inflame a man towards one woman and render him impotent towards another, and this he can secretly cause by the application of certain herbs or other matters of which he well knows the virtue for this purpose. Thirdly, he can disturb the apperception of a man or a woman, so that he makes one appear hideous to the other, for, as have been shown, he can influence the imagination. Fourthly, he can suppress the vigor of that member which is necessary for procreation, just as he can deprive any organ of the power of local motion. Fifthly, he can prevent the flow of the semen to the members in which is the motive power, by as it were closing the seminal ducts so that it does not descend into the genital vessels, or does not ascend again from them, or cannot come forth, or is spent vainly. It's also said that these types of bewitchments happen because a woman has been rejected or dumped by a man. I probably won't go into all of the other times boners are mentioned in this book, because then this video would never end. I just don't understand, this obsession that men have with their dicks and boners. Just fucking let it go, man. But okay, so now that we have put the boners behind us, let's move on to a funny story about a man who got turned into a donkey. A strong young man went to the house of a woman standing outside the city on the seashore, and asked her if she had any eggs to sell. The woman, seeing that he was a strong young man and a merchant far away from his own country, thought that on that account the people of the city would feel less suspicion if he were to be lost, and said to him, "Wait a little, and I will get you all that you want." And when she went in and shut the door and kept him waiting, the young man outside began to call out to her to hurry, lest he should miss his ship. Then the woman brought some eggs and gave them to the young man, and told him to hurry back to the ship in case he should miss it. So he hastened back to the ship, which was anchored by the shore, and before going on board, since the full company of his companions was not yet returned, he decided to eat the eggs there and refresh himself. And behold, an hour later he was made dumb, as if he had no power of speech, and he afterwards said he wondered what could have happened to him, but was unable to find out. Yet when he wished to go on board, he was driven off with sticks by those who yet remained ashore, and who all cried out, "Look what this ass is doing! Curse the beast! You are not coming on board!" The young man, being thus driven away, and understanding from their words that they thought he was an ass, reflected and began to suspect that he had been bewitched by the woman, especially since he could utter no word, although he understood all that was said. And when, on again trying to board the ship, he was driven off with heavier blows, he was in bitterness of heart compelled to remain and watch the ship sail away. And so, as he ran here and there, since everybody thought he was an ass, he was necessarily treated as such. At last, under compulsion, he went back to the woman's house, and to keep himself alive served her at her pleasure for 3 years, doing no work but to bring to the house such necessities such as wood and corn, and to carry away what had to be carried away, like a beast of burden. The only consolation that was left to him being that although everyone else took him for an ass, the witches themselves, severally and in company, who frequented the house, recognized him as a man, and he could talk and behave with them as a man should. After 3 years had passed in this way, in the 4th year it happened that the young man went one morning into the city, with the woman following a long way behind, and he passed by a church where Holy Mass was being celebrated, and heard the sacred bell ring at the elevation of the host, for in that kingdom the Mass is celebrated according to the Latin and not according to the Greek rite. And he turned towards this church, and not daring to enter for fear of being driven off with blows, knelt down outside by bending his knees of his hind legs, and lifted his forelegs, that is, his hands, joined together over his ass's head, as it was thought to be, and looked upon the elevation of the sacrament. And when some generous merchants saw this prodigy, they followed the ass in astonishment, discussing this marvel among themselves. And behold, the witch came and belaboured the ass with her stick, and because, as we have said, this sort of witchcraft is better known in those parts, at the instance of the merchants, the ass and the witch were taken before the judge, where being questioned and tortured, she confessed her crime and promised to restore the young man to his true shape if she might be allowed to return to her house. So she was dismissed and went back to her house, where the young man was restored to his former shape, and being again arrested, she paid the debt with her crimes merited. And the young man returned joyfully to his own country. Now, wouldn't that make a great script for Shrek 3? Anyway, the last few chapters of part 2 again deals with various ways you can cure yourself of bewitchment. It's pretty much the same thing as I mentioned before. Witchcraft is not cool, but Christian stuff is a-okay. The last chapter ends with what part 3 is going to be about, which is an in-depth guide to how the trials of witches should be carried out. Therefore, in the third part of this work, we shall treat the extermination of witches, which is the ultimate remedy, for this is the last resource of the Church, to which she is bound by divine commandment. For it has been said, "Ye shall not suffer witches to live upon the earth," and with this will be included the remedies against archer wizards, since this kind can only be exterminated by secular law. So that means we're finally at the third and last part of this book. I won't actually go in too much detail about this part because honestly, most of it is just incredibly uninteresting legal stuff about how to conduct a trial. There's barely any mentions of boners at all. So, the most common way for someone to be accused is that a witness bring forward an accusation. The character of the person who makes the accusation and the one accused matters, as it is said two mortal enemies cannot be admitted as witnesses. But it is asked whether the judge can admit the mortal enemies of the prisoner to give evidence against him in such a case. We answer that he cannot, for the same chapter of the canon says, "You must not understand that in this kind of charge the mortal personal enemy may be admitted to give evidence." But there are other serious degrees of enmity, for women are easily provoked to hatred, which need not totally disqualify a witness, although they render his evidence very doubtful, so that full credence cannot be placed in his words unless they are substantiated by independent proofs, and other witnesses supply an indubitable proof of them, for the judge must ask the prisoner whether he thinks that he has any enemy who would dare to accuse him of that crime out of hatred, so that he might compass his death, and if he says that he has, he shall ask who that person is, and then the judge shall take note whether the person named is being likely to give evidence from motives of malice has actually done so. So what happens if the accused denies everything? If asked first what is to be done when, as often happens, the accused denies everything, we answer that the judge has 3 points to consider, namely her bad reputation, the evidence of the fact, and the words of the witness. And he must see whether all these agree together. And then, according to the canon law, he must subject her to punishment, whether she has confessed her crime or not. There are 3 things that should be in agreement for the accusation to be believed, and those things are her reputation, the evidence of the fact, and the deposition of the witness. If all these conditions are met, then the accused should either be sent straight to prison, sent home and convicted if she tries to escape, or let the judge decide depending on the severity of the accusation. So most of the confessions that were acquired during the witch hunts came from torture. Various kinds of torture were very common at this time and was frequently used in witch trials. The Malleus suggested that torture should be held off for a little while after someone has been accused, as the devil had the power to grant the witch with the ability to resist pain. And the first is that he must not be too quick to subject a witch to examination, but must pay attention to certain signs which will follow. And he must not be too quick for this reason, unless God, through a holy angel, compels the devil to withhold his help from the witch, she will be so insensible to the pains of torture that she will sooner be torn limb from limb than confess any of the truth. But the torture is not to be neglected for this reason, for they are not all equally endowed with this power, and also the devil sometimes of his own will permits them to confess their crimes without being compelled by a holy angel. It's kind of frustrating how if they admitted they were using witchcraft, they were deemed a witch, and if they resisted the pain during torture and didn't admit, then they were also deemed a witch because the devil had made them impervious to pain. It's kind of heads I win, tails you lose situation. But if, after keeping the accused in a state of suspense and continually postponing the day of examination, and frequently using verbal persuasions, the judge should truly believe that the accused is denying the truth, let them question her lightly without shedding blood, knowing that such questioning is fallacious and often, as have been said, ineffective, and it should be begun in this way. While the officers are preparing for the questioning, let the accused be stripped, or if she is a woman, let her first be led to the penal cells and there stripped by honest women of good reputation. And the reason for this is that they should search for any instruments of witchcraft sewn into her clothes, for they often make such instruments. And the instructions of devils out of the limbs of unbaptized children, the purpose being that those children should be deprived of the beatific vision, and when such instruments have been disposed of, the judge shall use his own persuasions and those of other honest men zealous for the faith to induce her to confess the truth voluntarily, and if she will not, let him order the officers to bind her with cords and apply her some engine of torture, and then let them obey at once, but not joyfully, rather appearing to be disturbed by their duty. Then let her be released again at someone's earnest request and taken on one side, and let her again be persuaded, and in persuading her, let her be told that she can escape the death penalty. Another thing that was common during the witch trials was to shave the entire body of the accused, as long hair was thought to be able to hide a so-called devil's mark, or various charms. The devil's mark was a mark that was given to the witch by the devil after she joined a pact with him. It was thought to be fairly small, red, and unable to feel pain, and it was believed to often be hidden under hair. Many witches were then shaved and pricked all over their body in search of this mark. The third precaution to be observed in this 10th action is that the hair should be shaved from every part of her body. The reason for this is the same as that for stripping her of her clothes, which we have already mentioned, for in order to preserve their power of silence, they are in the habit of hiding some superstitious object in their clothes or in their hair, or even in the most secret parts of their bodies, which must not be named. The Malleus also suggested that the accused could be tricked into confessing by taking her to a castle where she will live under observation, then bring in a few honest women that will promise her that she'll be set free if she teaches them sorcery. Quite lately, a witch was detained in the castle of Königsheim, near the town of Schlettstadt in the Diocese of Strasbourg, and could not be induced by any tortures or questions to confess her crimes. But at last the castellan used the method we have just described. Although he was himself present in the castle, the witch thought he was away, and 3 of his household came in to her and promised they would set her free if she would teach them how to do certain things. At first she refused, saying that they were trying to entrap her, but at last she asked what it was that they wanted to know, and one asked how to raise a hailstorm, and another asked about carnal matters. When at length she agreed to show him how to raise a hailstorm, and a bowl of water had been brought in, the witch told him to stir the water with his finger, and herself uttered certain words, and suddenly the place which she had named, a wood near the castle, was visited by such a tempest and storm of hail as had not been seen for many years. So the last chapters of the Malleus are just going through 16 different ways of bringing the trial process to an end. The sentences for witchcraft range from life in prison with just bread and water to the death penalty in which the accused was burnt. I actually won't be going through those last few chapters because honestly it's just 16 chapters of like 15th century Christian legal stuff. Anyway, that's the book. I'm surprised if any of you have made it this far to the end. I gotta say, I struggled a lot with getting through this book. It was just so... Honestly, it was very boring, and it was a lot of misogynistic stuff, and I've kind of removed the most boring stuff, and everything that was even remotely interesting has made it into this video. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, it would really help me out if you gave it a like and subscribed. Also, feel free to add a comment down below if you have anything to say about this book. It would be really fun to read some of your replies. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!